All right, welcome. Great to see you tonight. We had a wonderful evening with Nicole Doyley last Wednesday night, and this is a second of a two-part series called Conversations on Race that our Great Commission leadership team put together this fall in correlating with our series on the Free Methodist Way, especially the value of the Free Methodist Church of love-driven justice. There's many areas in which we could touch on justice and having a more just society, but as we know, over the last several months and years, and I mean throughout our history, race has been a major flashpoint for that. And you know, our church history as Free Methodists is rooted in a desire to bring more justice in the area of race relations, born at the period of the Civil War as a denomination with leadership that fought for abolition. And so we're in that long line of history to be interested in and care about and desire to learn about and be educated about issues related to justice. So last week, Nicole brought a wonderful presentation to us, enlightened my mind. I hope was enlightening to you about some of the ways throughout history justice for people of color has been hard to come by, even though many strides have been made. But more is yet to be done. And we are praying and seeking the Lord for how we as Christians, how we as peers can be an advocate for a more just world in the sense of love-driven justice, as God's word calls us to. So I was introduced to Shane Wiegand through some from our congregation who attended a workshop he led at Northeastern Seminary last year. And so he was suggested as a possible presenter for one of these 2 evenings of conversations on race. And when we reached out to him, he was very glad to participate and come be part of this evening with us. And I'm just going to give a little biographical information. He's a 4th grade teacher in the Rush Henrietta School District, currently taking a sabbatical to focus on his other love, which he found doing these 2 things were like 2 full-time jobs. But he also co-leads the anti-racist curriculum project hosted by the Pathstone Foundation. He's trained over 1,200 teachers in anti-racist curriculum and presented to over 10,000 people throughout our county. So has really got a lot of history and experience and expertise and opportunity to interact with people across a number of different venues, including churches. And so we're glad you could be with us tonight. A couple other things about Shane. He went to SUNY Geneseo, where he was involved in the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and was a large group coordinator there. He's part of Browncroft Community Church, recently elected to the 40 Under 40 by the Rochester Business Journal here in Rochester. And so, you know, a man of kind of a significant reputation in our community who's doing good things. And so we're really glad to have you here tonight. I'd like to just give you a warm welcome, and then I'll offer prayer. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we praise you for your love for us, for the opportunity to hear of the area of how race has been such a subject of challenge in our community over the years historically, and that then some things can be brought to light in our minds tonight so we can understand better what some of the challenges are, some of the concerns, the needs are, so we can also empathize and be a bright spot ourselves as a church and as believers in trying to prepare and create a more just world in which people of all races can be celebrated and experience the kinds of just opportunities that maybe they have not had for some time. So give us wisdom tonight, give us grace, open our hearts and minds, help us be ready to receive what you would teach us tonight as Shane shares with us from his background and experience and learning. And we praise you that we are here in your presence and that you will guide this evening. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Shane, welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me tonight, for hosting me at your beautiful church. I've never been to Pierce, I don't think. Maybe when I was in youth group at some point, but I honestly, I don't know. I'm not sure. It's a possibility. But it's an honor to be here and to share some of my story as a Christian, as an educator, as someone involved in the housing justice movement in Rochester. I'm real involved with City Roots Community Land Trust and Connected Communities. And the reason I'm involved in so much of this sort of work and sharing this story across town and with schools and universities and folks like yourself is because the impact on learning some of this local history and investigating some of my family's history and our story and the way it's intersected with some really unfortunate parts and uncomfortable parts of our community and our country's history had a really powerful effect on me. And what repentance looked like and justice looked like for me has been trying to own this story and help other folks understand it better and use it to move forward towards justice and equity here in the greater Rochester area. Question? Oh, is this better? How's that? Oh, I feel stronger now. Hello. I got to be honest with you all right now. It's a little weird talking to people in person. I do this like on Zoom 3 times a week, and I'm like, I keep expecting that I'm wearing sweatpants, and I'm not. Like, you know, the sweatpants dress shirt, I never do that, but and I'm sure none of you do either. But, so that's a little bit about me and why I'm here tonight. And the story I want to tell you is a story that's being taught in classrooms all across Monroe County. Not every school district is telling this story of local history, but we're hoping that it's something that continues to grow so that students can have a chance to honestly engage with their community's history and decide what they want to do with that knowledge. I'm part of this amazing team co-led by Keisha James and myself. Is this echoing? Oh, it's okay. Keisha James and myself, we have a host of teachers. We just hired 8 more to write curriculum for grades 2, 4, 5, 8, 11, and 12 on the local history for Black and Latino folks in our community, the racist policies in our community, past and present, and the way people have come together, both white and Black, to resist and to build a more just and equitable Rochester. The sources I'm going to rely heavily on today, the first is from my good friend Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law. He's sort of the scholar on redlining and housing justice in our country. He is incredible. He's been through these slides and given me feedback. I had 2 mistakes. I had a misspelling. It was really hard for me as a 4th grade teacher. It was a Supreme Court justice's name, and so I was a little embarrassed, and then, but it's fixed, so don't worry about that. And he's been fantastic helping us tell this national story locally. You'll see the New York State Commission on Discrimination from 1958, the newspaper archive for the Democrat and Chronicle, as well as a ton of oral histories from the public library and countless interviews I've had the chance to do myself with friends of mine who are activists for racial justice in our community, both from the 50s and still activists active in this movement today. A piece of scripture that I want to start with that has centered me in this work and that I'd like to kind of ground our conversation in today is the story of Zacchaeus from Luke chapter 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector who was wealthy, and he wanted to see who Jesus was. Because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. I can relate to that. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him. And since Jesus was coming that way, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once, and he welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this, and they began to mutter, "He's gone to be a guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man, too, is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what is lost." And the story of someone who had taken from others, who had benefited from unjust policy from the state, owning that and seeking to make repair is sort of what this story that I'm going to tell about tonight is about. It's going to be about what does it mean to take action towards ending racism in our community. Dr. Beverly Tatum describes the system of racism in our country as kind of like a moving walkway at an airport. Anyone ever been on one of those? They're a whole lot of fun. And you got that jerk who's walking really fast on it. He's like really wants to get to where he's going. We've all been brushed by that person, right? That's the person who's demonstrating racist action, who's on board with racial inequality. These are your Klan members. These are your people who are enforcing racist policies that are on the books. Then you have me for most of my life, the passive racist, the person who's kind of standing still on the moving walkway. I'm just trying to be nice to everyone. I'm trying not to see color, trying to just, do my thing and be a nice person. But I'm not doing anything to actively fight racial injustice or to eliminate the segregation or inequality in our community. And what destination does that person end up at? The same place as the person who's acting racist on that walkway, where the anti-racist turns around, takes action in the opposite direction, moving faster than that moving walkway, working towards equity and justice in our community. Because the thing is, in Rochester, we have a long legacy of racial injustice, starting with a group of enslavers who helped found this community, who purchased this land, like Colonel Rochester, who bought the land that is today Rochester, New York, with a sale of enslaved Africans from his work plantation in Maryland, or people like Daniel Penfield, who brought enslaved Africans with them to help work at his mill for no pay, towns like Henrietta, Gates, all towns named for people who enslaved African people. And yet, they're very much a part of our community's story, as well as someone like a Frederick Douglass, who fought against slavery and in our community, or the Free Methodist Church, or people like Austin Stewart, who was enslaved actually in Sodus, New York, escaped to Rochester, ended up opening the first black-owned business, a spot on the Underground Railroad, the first school that black children were legally allowed to attend. We've got this rich legacy in our community of Rochester of taking action around women's rights with, of course, Susan B. Anthony. We have a legacy of innovation, of design, of creativity. And the thing is, we're going to need that same spirit of abolition, of fighting for justice, of innovation if we're going to move forward in our community. And we're also going to need faith. And we have a long legacy of faith leaders here in Rochester, from Thomas James, who was enslaved in New York State, opened the first black-owned church, AME Zion, downtown, to Reverend Body, to Quentin Primo, to Minister Florence, to people like Myra Brown today, who have taken a stand against injustice in our community. And it's going to require all of these things to move forward, as well as an owning of how we got to this place, because today we're faced with some very stark realities, according to the census statistics and data pulled together by my friends at the ACT Rochester, at the Community Foundation, who in 2020 found that black children in our region are more than 4 times as likely as white children to live in poverty, that both African Americans and Latinos are less than half as likely to own their own homes as their white counterparts. How can that much disparity be in place? When you look at this map that shows where people live in our community, a blue dot represents a white person, a green represents black. You can see our suburbs are largely white. Our inner city, particularly on the northwest side, or what many call the crescent, is predominantly black and Latinx. In fact, in New York State, we have the most schools. Our state has the most segregated schools as a whole in all 50 United States, more than Mississippi, more than Alabama. And the border between Penfield and Rochester is the #1 most segregating school district borderline in all 50 states. The town of Brighton is the 6th most segregated in the country, and West Irondequoit schools have the 7th most segregated schools in all 50 states. In our community, your zip code can determine how long you live. A child born in the predominantly black zip code, 14608, downtown Rochester, previously redlined, is expected to live 9 years less than a child born in Pittsford, a predominantly white neighborhood in our community. When it comes to wealth, there's a significant gap nationally, about 10 times gap between white and black folks when it comes to wealth. When it comes to home ownership, even with the passage of something like the Fair Housing Act, the gap ever widens between white and black, as well as the actual values of their homes. You can see this in the ACT Rochester data. It matches that national story. So what can we do? This is kind of the central message of my talk here, right from James Baldwin. He writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I know that for me, it's been a struggle to face some of this history. Today, we're going to look at some things that are uncomfortable, that are going to make us have some feelings come up, to feel a little discomfort as we learn about some uncomfortable parts of our community's history. But it's my hope that we can have that courage to face it, that we can kind of live out these words that Issa Macaulay, in his excellent book, Reading While Black, writes. He says, "Peacemaking can't be separated from truth-telling. The church's witness doesn't involve simply denouncing the excesses of both sides and making moral equivalencies. It involves calling injustice by its name. If the church is going to be on the side of peace in the United States, there has to be an honest accounting of what this country has done and continues to do to black and brown people. Moderation or middle ground is not always the loci of righteousness. And the thing is, in our community, fighting against injustice is something that has always been done. Facing racial injustice head on is something that black community members have always done. From Austin Stewart and Frederick Douglass in the times of slavery to when redlining began in our community, people like Howard Coles, whose daughter serves on our advisory board at the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, in the 1930s with his black newspaper, he was the only one to call redlining out, to call out the banks and real estate agents and city leaders and suburban leaders for not allowing black people to live anywhere but 2 neighborhoods of the city. His friend Dr. Anthony Jordan, Rochester's second black doctor, did some deep research in these neighborhoods and the black and white populations. He found in the 40s that in Rochester, the black death rate from all causes was 50% higher than that of whites. And when it came to deaths related to tuberculosis, a pandemic at that time, much like today, the death rate among people of color was 2.5 times that of whites, which is very similar to the death rates in Rochester when it comes to COVID-19. Almost 10 years after Howard Coles was calling out the institutionalized racial segregation in housing, the Reverend Body at Mount Olivet Baptist Church described it in the paper as an enigma to people of color when it comes to finding housing, saying in Rochester, only 2 areas have been made gracefully available for him. And if any attempt is made to move out of these black ghettos, the attempt is met with opposition. And today we're going to look at the forms of opposition that people of color like the Reverend Body faced when they sought to buy a home or live where they chose or build wealth or community for their family. We're going to look at this in the areas of the real estate industry, racially restrictive covenants, the VA and FHA-backed mortgages that came through redlining. We're going to talk about urban renewal and displacement. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about segregation and education, both past and present. With every instance of racist policy that I show you, I'm going to pair it with the stories of people of color and their allies who faced these problems as they came and are continuing to face these problems today. At the end, we're going to take some time to react. What's something that new that you learned? What's a feeling that came up? That'll be the first question we answer. And then we're going to move into answering this question. What does it mean for us as a church community in Rochester to own this history and to truly repair some of the harm that's been done? And then we'll open it up to questions, next steps, and what else we can do. All right. The story today starts with the Great Migration. In 1910, people of color start moving from the south to the north in droves. Over 5-6 million people move from the south to cities like Rochester in search of better jobs, better lives, fleeing white domestic terrorism from the Ku Klux Klan, the lack of voting rights. And when they arrived to northern cities like Rochester and Chicago, they were met with a different kind of racism. And the first form, before any federal policy came into play, was their real estate board or real estate brokers. In the early 1900s, real estate agents across the country organized into a political group called the National Real Estate Boards. And written into their code of ethics, it explicitly said this: a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. If you were a real estate agent and showed a black man a home in a white neighborhood, you would lose your real estate license. And that's exactly what happened in Rochester. Frank Drum was one of our real estate board presidents and also the head of Alliance Realty, the biggest real estate firm north of New York City. And when Howard Coles, who you met just a few slides earlier, shared his story and started speaking out, he actually got his real estate license. And he started showing black people homes in Rochester suburbs. He was forced to do it in the cover of night so that the other white real estate agents wouldn't see him doing this, but eventually he was found out and he was forced out of his job. Again, another example, my good friend Dr. Walter Cooper. He's 93 years old. He was a New York State regent, good friends with Malcolm X, Bobby Kennedy, John Lewis. This guy's a hero. He lives in Penfield today, and he's on our board for the Curriculum Project, but he also was one of the leaders of the NAACP in Rochester in the 50s. And when he arrived here to finish his PhD work, he describes a situation like this: I confronted the housing segregation in Rochester. It was 1954, and the wife and I answered ads for 69 apartments, and we were refused at all of them. Or his good friend, Dr. Alice Holloway Young, who's also a friend of mine, an incredible woman. She just won the New York State Liberty Medal. School number 3 was recently named for her. She was the first black principal in all of Monroe County and a founding member of the Board of Trustees at Monroe Community College. And in 1957, here she is with her PhD, upper middle class woman. Her and her husband, James, decided we want a bigger house and we want more room for our young sons to play in. We want to live in the 19th ward. But at that time, there were no black people in the 19th ward. In fact, it was a green line neighborhood, meaning that a black person couldn't get a loan in one of those neighborhoods. But Dr. Young figured, I'm Dr. Young. I can do this. So she goes to every real estate agent in town, and not a single one would show her a home where she wanted to look. She goes to every bank in town, ESL, Lincoln Mortgage, First Savings. Every single one denied her a mortgage because of the color of her skin. So she reached out to her friend, Harper Sibley, who is heiress of the Western Union Telegraph fortune. She was a member of the NAACP. And Harper Sibley actually bought her a house on Millbank Street. Sight unseen, Alice Young didn't get to tour it. Alice Young and her husband moved in the middle of the night, started paying a private mortgage. And sure enough, the next morning, she found a threat from the Ku Klux Klan, who had gathered trying to burn down her family's house. They faced death threats, terrorism from the Ku Klux Klan for the next 17 years. But Alice has asked that when I share her story, I also mention the story of the Bushes. They were the one white family on the street who decided to ally themselves with the Youngs, who stood with them, who helped protect them when terrorists would come and try to push them out of the neighborhood, helping them live there for the next 17 years. We don't think of Rochester, though, as a Klan community. We've reserved that for the South. But this is East Rochester High School in the 1920s. Over 20,000 Klansmen and their families wearing their full robes, burning 3 50-foot-high crosses in celebration of white supremacy. Crosses were burned in families' homes of color in Gates and Henrietta, well documented in the DNC up until the late 1970s. Another area of opposition when people of color attempted to build wealth or live where they wanted to live or own a home or just be a part of the American dream was something called a racially restrictive covenant. This was something that I started to learn about with my students as we were researching and learning more about this. And we started going to the county clerk's office. And if you don't know this, at Monroe County Clerk's office, every deed to every house and land in Monroe County is documented. It's on really smelly, vinegary film, microfilm. Someone who went to college here might remember being in a dark library basement, spending some dark times with some dark film. And there's some pretty rough film over there. In fact, there's tens of thousands of deeds across Monroe County that explicitly bar people of color from owning homes. It's something called a racially restrictive covenant. And my friends at City Roots Land Trust, where I serve on the board, partnered with my students, as well as the students at Yale Law School's Environmental Protection Clinic. And last summer, we published a massive report documenting who and how and what and where these racial covenants were across Monroe County. And what we found was really surprising. The first was this, that the Monroe County Legislature and county supervisor, every single one, voted in favor of putting restrictive covenants like this exact one on hundreds of county tax foreclosed homes. This is de jure or legalized, voted upon housing segregation. On these homes, it said, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot on this covenant. They did this in 1939, 1940, and 1941. But Kodak led the way. In the 1920s, George Eastman and his friend Harry Haight, who helped found ESL Bank, they bought a bunch of land in Brighton, right by the high school. It's called Meadowbrook. The Meadowbrook neighbored almost 371 homes. When Kodak bought this land and created ESL Bank to finance the loans for all of these homes, they wanted to protect these homes. And what they did to protect it is they put on every single deed, no lot or dwelling could be sold to or occupied by a black person. And today, that neighborhood is less than 4% black. You can see some effectiveness happening there, but it fit with what Kodak was doing with its hiring policies. A New York State commission that was brought through the NAACP found that in 1939, Kodak, out of its 35,000 employees, had just one black employee. They found that at Bausch & Lomb, there were 0 black employees, and that the only black employee at Kodak was working behind a broom. But these covenants are everywhere in our community. And I'm going to go a little overkill showing you these, as well as showing you the way the Democrat and Chronicle wholesale endorsed these and showed them as something that you should have on your home if you're going to be a good white person. Notice rigid restrictions for desirable social character advertised right here in the Democrat and Chronicle at Council Rock, or in Gates Chili right down the road from here. The entire school board voted and signed on to this racial covenant under the school, saying this school could never be used by members not of the Caucasian race. Or the Catholic Church, Bishop James O'Hearn, putting racial covenants on church buildings and rectories to ensure that no black members could attend. Or in Pittsford, East Avenue Estates, hundreds of homes advertised right here in the Democrat and Chronicle as whites only. Or in Irondequoit, over 2,000 covenants, that entire northwest Irondequoit area. One of those homes was bought by Walter Wegman, founder of Wegmans Food Markets. He bought that home and he signed the paperwork agreeing to the racial covenant, something he didn't have to do. And when that covenant expired decades later, he sold his house and forced in that restrictive covenant to stay on that deed. And he used the money from that home to help invest in building one of the biggest grocery chains in the country, right? Using that equity to start a business. Or Forest Lawn in Webster, in Penfield, Ellison Park Heights, all throughout Greece. You'll see people like the head of the Builders Association, Norman Huck, building hundreds of homes that were explicitly whites only in the deeds. Again, head of the Builders Association right here in Gates by Brooklyn Country Club. Or Early Case, also putting hundreds of homes in Gates Chili, explicitly just for folks of the Caucasian race. But again, head of the Bar Association. This wasn't a small fringe group of people. This was the establishment. This was the people in charge. It was endorsed, it was known, it was talked about, and it was something that was happening. But as always, people of color called this racism out for what it was. They chose to face it and take action, like Judge Davis, Rochester's first black judge, at the time its second black lawyer. It was 1958, and he says in his oral history, "My wife and I were looking for a house. It was 1958. We saw a house we liked on 135 Elmdorf Ave in Rochester, just a block or so west of Genesee. I'd say there were probably 4 black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee at the time. One would be Alice Young and her family. The owner refused to sell to us because we were black. There was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians." And before I finish his story, Italians, Jewish, Eastern European folks were often mentioned in these covenants and were not deemed Caucasian. Remember, this is the 1930s and 40s when these covenants are going on. This is the rise of Hitler. This is Princeton, Harvard, U of R, Yale, all having PhD tenured professors doing incredible research on eugenics, on white Anglo-Saxon Protestants being the super race. In fact, in the 20s and 30s, Rochester's Super Race Foundation for the Betterment of the Caucasian Race would meet regularly at churches all across Rochester, spreading this message of hate. So at the time, being Italian would not be something that would qualify you for a government mortgage and could legally be enforced against you. But in 1944, with us entering into World War II, the federal government passed the GI Bill, which gave access to GIs to home loans from the government, or FHA or GI loans, but only for white people. Judge Davis fought for his country in World War II in battle, and when he came home, the government would not allow him to get a government loan to purchase a home. Whereas a white person who was Jewish or Italian became legally white with the passing of that law, and these covenants no longer applied, and they could have access to home ownership anywhere they chose, whereas Judge Davis didn't have that right until 1968. But Judge Davis was tricky. In fact, he describes himself as devious, and he was part of the NAACP. And when the realtor at Nothnagel, one of Rochester's biggest real estate firms, now Howard Hanna, refused to sell him the home, enforcing the racial covenant on the deed, he said this: "We had to go through devious methods. I had a white friend who bought the house and transferred it to me. And that was the way he was able to move in on Elmdorf Ave in the 19th Ward, describing his situation, even for someone of significant means, upper middle class gentleman like himself, did not have access to living where he wanted without significant risk and danger in trying to do it. The black spaces on this map represent the areas of our community where almost every home has a racially restrictive covenant. This map was created by Yale Law School for us to use, and students across the county are learning about this and about the neighborhoods in their communities. We have researchers at U of R and RIT continuing to go through the county clerk's office because we estimate there are several thousand more of these deeds that we just have yet to find because they're all on microfilm and it takes a while. But you'll see every single town in our community has these racial covenants as well as in the city. And this is some heavy stuff. So take a deep breath if you need to. Grab one of those delicious refreshments if you're like, whew, that's some heavy stuff to learn about our community. I'm not done. Because these racial covenants get enforced in a different way. They become codified. Real estate board, the builders associations, the appraisers associations, they lobby. People in Rochester lobby Congress. And in 1934 becomes successful in creating the biggest home ownership boom from 1930s up through the 1960s that invests over $119 billion into mortgage insurance so that white families could have access to home ownership. FDR, from New York State, former governor, signs the 1934 National Housing Act into law. You can see him doing it right there with his friends. You'll notice there are no black people at the table, nor women at the table. Instead, it's mostly wealthy rich men, mostly from the North, not from the South, signing into law one of the most racist policies since enslavement that our country has seen. Because written right into this policy, and here's a screenshot. It explicitly says that if a neighborhood is to be stable, it's necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes, saying a change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. Something I think people still say today. It even goes so far as to say, to be most effective, deed restrictions should be put on any deeds that receive government money in order to be most effective, prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they're intended. Even going so far as to say highways should be built to separate inharmonious racial groups, which is a big part of how 490 and the Inner Loop were able to receive the government funds in order to be built. Finally, and this is where for me as an educator, it starts to really hit home and explain my experience at the segregated school that I grew up in Webster, is that right into the law, it also said that you had to make sure that the school in a neighborhood that kids would be going to was not an integrated school, or else that neighborhood would be given a hazardous rating. Now, it's difficult to look at these people in power, people with reputations that are often seen as very positive, like FDR, who did good things, and I'm not discounting the good things these folks may have done. I'm trying to tell more of that story, right? Ibram Kendi, in his excellent book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas, says that time and again, powerful and brilliant men and women have produced racist ideas in order to justify the racist policies of their era. Or to help us think about this another way, the author Ajama Alua writes, the ultimate goal of racism is the profit and comfort of the white race, specifically of rich white men. And when both of my grandfathers voted for these people to be in office, and both of them in the 50s were able to get FHA government loans that allowed them to buy houses in the suburbs that they could not have bought as working class folks without the federal mortgage insurance and subsidy or government handout that helped them buy their house, they would not have been able to buy those homes. They would not have been able to build wealth from those homes. Both grandfathers' homes dramatically increased in value. They built significant equity. They used that equity to send both of my parents to college. My grandparents helped send me to college. They helped me buy my house that I own today. Generational wealth created through home ownership, but only for some in our community. It wasn't until 1968 that people of color had that same access. And so when I think about my own story, I didn't choose this. I didn't vote for this. I didn't do this. But it's part of my story, and part of why I am where I am today with a master's degree, a home, as an educator, is because of a policy that was only for some that built wealth and access, security, and freedom. And the way they did this was enforcing it through something called redlining. So the law had maps created of almost every city in the United States. Here's Rochester's. And neighborhoods would be rated based on race and class and those other qualifications that you saw. A green and blue neighborhood meant best because they were 100% white, middle and upper middle class. You could get the best deal, the most government subsidy to repair your home or buy a home in those neighborhoods. And all the suburbs fell under that. Yellow meant declining, so if you were white, you could still get a loan, but maybe not as good in some of those neighborhoods. And red meant hazardous. If even one person of color lived in one of those neighborhoods, or Italian or Jewish population was there, it would oftentimes get that redlined hazardous rating, meaning no government investment, and people of color would be forced into living in those neighborhoods. Here's the actual area descriptions that the federal government made of some of our neighborhoods in Rochester. You can go online and look at all of these at Mapping Inequality. Notice the qualifications right at the top, class and race. Notice black folks, 75% in the Cornhill neighborhood, therefore hazardous. Compare that to Pittsford, East Avenue Estates, every home with a racial covenant on it, 0% black 20 years after it was built. Therefore, it got that blue rating, meaning if you were white, you could get a 30-year mortgage subsidized by the government and move in. The neighborhood I live in today, Beechwood, was a red line neighborhood. Today, my neighborhood is 75% black, but at the time, 2%. In part, this is segregation by design, right? Or compare it to Kodak's Meadowbrook. Again, racial covenant on every home, 0% black, therefore a green-lined best rating. All of the suburbs were green-lined. And to give you some scope and scale of just how effective this policy was, in 1960, the DNC reported that Rochester's most integrated suburb was Henrietta, with just 11 individual people of color living in that town. Folks of significant means like Dr. Walter Cooper, one of the leaders of the NAACP, who organized with his wife Helen and a few other friends to move into Henrietta in solidarity. He's told me that the reason he moved to Henrietta is because no other suburb was he able to squeeze his way in. Henrietta was one of the least developed towns at the time, and he was able to find a white real estate agent who was sympathetic to their cause and was willing to break their rules and help them and a few of their friends purchase a home. Richard Rothstein gives us some national scale, telling us that half of all new mortgages nationwide during this period of time were insured by the FHA and VA, explicitly using these racist laws, giving out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance to over 35 million families who benefited from these loans, 98% of whom, like my family, were white. The other way, though, that people were kept out of their towns, that were kept out of moving into white neighborhoods or white communities, is something not unique to Rochester, something that was national, but a huge deal here in this community, called a blackface minstrel show. At a blackface minstrel show, there's usually 3 or 4 main characters called N-men. They use burnt cork to blacken their faces, they paint on garish red lips, and they sing songs mocking the intelligence of people of color. The N-men's names are often Black Sambo, Jim Crow, Mr. Bones, horrifically racist, and honestly pretty terrifying images to look at. You can see this on the front page of the Honeoye Fall Times. In 1960, right? This is something that a black child would have to see if they went to school. Who would send their kid to this school? It was a clear message, right? Every single winter and spring, schools, churches would put these shows on. Even town halls would put them on, making it very clear who was welcome and who was seen as less than. Kodak, of course, led the way in the 1920s and 30s, proudly publishing photos of executives and their children in blackface. That does say the children of James Wiegand. My name is spelled I-E, not E-I, but it was too close, so I had to put the picture in. But you'll see this at school number 5. This is the DNC celebrating the return of Old Black Joe. How, again, 1950s, the DNC is like, this is something great to put on the front page. The Jewish Youth Association had their annual blackface show. Aquinas having its annual blackface show. Brighton High School's annual Licorice Lights performance on the main stage of the high school. Spencerport, Allendale, Columbia putting on their annual show in conjunction with the Memorial Art Gallery. You'll see Newark Junior High School, RIT, almost every single community, the Lutherans and Presbyterians putting on their regular blackface shows. Pittsford's Catholic Church, in conjunction with the town hall, putting on their annual blackface show. The Methodists all across town. I don't think the Free Methodists, though. I haven't found the Free Methodists. And I'll be honest, I looked this morning to double check. The jury's still out on the Free Methodists here. Now, these are the towns so far that I've found that have hosted these shows at almost an annual basis from the early 1900s until the late 1960s. And they didn't stop until the NAACP finally decided to take a huge stand. The Reverend Primo had moved into East Irondequoit. He'd faced a petition of 100 neighbors demanding that he and his wife not move in because they'd be throwing all-night drinking parties. This man was the head reverend at St. Simon's Episcopalian Church. And the bishop, who was white, had to intercede on his behalf to finally help them buy their home. They move in after facing that kind of terror and scariness from their neighbors, and they send their kids to school in East Irondequoit and find one of these blackface shows. So he goes back and finds out his friends at the NAACP are seeing this too when they're starting to push their way into neighborhoods. So he fights back. He starts a letter writing campaign with his friend Flora Harris, sending letters to every school in the county as well as to the DNC, like this one, saying blackface shows must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, public buildings, saying to do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all the white youth involved in these community-accepted shows towards all the dark-skinned people of the world. I think so often we look at something like that redlining map or racial covenants and say, that must have been something that was done to Rochester, or the big bad government coming in and making us do something. When in fact, what was happening in all of our schools, our churches, our town halls, tells a story of widespread acceptance and really a culture, when you look at these images, of deep-seated racism here in Monroe County. Activists of color kept fighting back. In 1958, New York State started to listen, not with any action, but with a report, something we often get. Governor Harriman had this report commissioned to investigate what was going on outside of New York City. They found that in the 1950s, 80% of all black people in Rochester lived in just two neighborhoods, the redlined 3rd Ward, that Clarissa Street, Ford Street, Troop Street area, and the redlined 7th Ward, Clinton, Joseph, Hudson. They found that more than 1,600 units in these neighborhoods had no bathrooms or shared bathrooms. And in more than 2,000 units, more than one person was living in each room. And this incredible overcrowding led to a lot of trouble. And one person, an incredibly brave individual, Constance Mitchell, decided to run for office and to dethrone Lester Peck and try to do something to fight redlining that he was enforcing at the county supervisor board. She writes this: "We were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house on Gregg Street, the agent told us, 'I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Avenue. They're just not open to black people.'" Remember Jefferson Avenue? It was one of those red lines. It was also in the news last spring where Daniel Prude was killed while in police custody. Again, Jefferson Avenue, one of those lines. She writes, "So we were confined from Jefferson Ave back to the river to look for a place to live on the west side of the city. It took her 2 tries, but finally she won, and she got on there as the first woman to ever be on the county supervisor, as well as the first person of color to ever be elected to office in Monroe County." I'll tell you what, I never learned about Constance Mitchell growing up, that she was our first person of color. I never learned that Malcolm X regularly visited her house. So did Dr. Martin Luther King, right? I didn't know that she worked on John F. Kennedy's campaign, that she marched from Selma to Montgomery, and she recently passed away here in our community. Her daughter is working with us to write a book about her mom's story that we hope will be read by thousands of children across Monroe County, as well as her stories in our curriculum. One of those people that we should not be forgetting in our community. Also a devout Christian. The report goes on to tell us that in the 7th and 3rd wards, 30% of all housing units didn't have running water. Because remember, no investment was able to go into these neighborhoods because of redlining. Trash pickup was limited, conditions were awful. It found that 57 black families were able to own a home outside of the 3rd and 7th Ward neighborhood, like the Wells family, who joined the Coopers and Henrietta, or the Biases, who moved into Irondequoit in 1964. Their neighbors threw rocks through their window. They were threatened with death. They decided it's not worth it. Dr. Bias decided to sell their house, and they moved to Henrietta, Gatehouse Trail. But when the developer realized they were black, he denied them that home. So they had to take it all the way to the New York State Supreme Court and eventually won for the right to live in this home right there on Gatehouse Trail. I know I already shared a little bit of the story of the Primos having to fight the petition in their neighborhood. Or how about Dick Ricketts, star of Rochester Royals NBA team? We used to have an NBA team here in Rochester. It took him 16 months to find an apartment, despite being a superstar and a celebrity. Eventually, Dr. Cooper found him a place to live. He had to stay in a hotel because no one would rent to him because of his skin color. Or Peter Tolliver, an engineer at Xerox. In 1960, he and his wife tried to buy a house on Verena Drive in Brighton. Before the final paperwork was signed, all of his neighbors pooled their money together, went to the bank, and illegally bought the house out from under them. He was part of the NAACP and had to sue. Eventually, Gordon Howe, county supervisor, was shamed enough to stay with the Tollivers and help them earn that home, where Mrs. Tolliver still lives to this day. Or Ellen Stubbs, who had to sue for the right to live in her home, as well as integrate the town of Greece in 1963. Countless stories. I could go on for another hour of stories just like that all across our community of people of color that faced these kinds of stories and fought back, many of whom did not win those fights. The report documented that not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any person of color in any Rochester suburb, at least until 1958. And I gotta get a quick drink here, hold on. That's better. The next thing that happened is called urban renewal. So if you have all these neighborhoods, and for almost 40 years, you don't put any money into them, you force people of color to live there. They're living on top of each other. A street like Jefferson Avenue, Olga Edwards, who was a librarian at the time, person of color, living on Jefferson Avenue, recalls how the Baden-Ormond area, or 7th Ward, was almost completely demolished over where Tops is, now Pepsi and the Coca-Cola bottling plant, a Black and Latino neighborhood, demolished. By these men, Elmer Milliman of Central Trust Bank, who headed the Urban Renewal Committee, which had $30 million in federal funds to do something about Black neighborhoods, or slums they called it, and renew them, which sounds really nice. John Dale from the city worked on these plans in this public committee. Howard Coles tried to get on this committee, but was denied because of the color of his skin, and significant damage was done, and significant displacement. In the 7th Ward, 886 families had their homes torn down and were forced out. 60% of them were Black folks. And where could they go? Not to Chili, not to Webster, not to Henrietta. They ended up in the 3rd Ward, on Jefferson Avenue. White families on Jefferson Avenue would often chop their homes, single-family homes, 1,500 square feet, into 5 apartments, with 5 families sharing the same bathroom and the same kitchen. People being stacked on top of each other, as Olga Edwards describes. And then later, in the early 60s, 850 families were displaced as the inner loop was built, cutting right through what was then Rochester's Black Broadway, the Clarissa Street neighborhood, where jazz legends and greats would come to the Pythod. They'd get snacks at Jesse Stevens grocery store, then the only Black-owned grocery store. Now there is no Black-owned grocery store in our community because it was destroyed when the highway came through. And this led to a lot of problems because as people start losing their homes, they start getting displaced. These are thousands of people getting uprooted from where they've lived for 20 years, getting forced to the other side of town. There's going to be some problems. There's going to be some tension. There's going to be some police called in. There's going to be issues, right? When people don't have running water in 30% of these properties. And Rochester had a choice at the time. We could fight for equitable housing. We could fight for anti-racist housing policy. The suburbs could open up and allow people to live there. Affordable housing could be built in multiple places. But that was not what was chosen to be funded. In the 60s, the Rochester area chose to fund the county sheriff's department and Rochester Police Department, dramatically increasing their numbers and enforcing a policy of containment, over-policing these neighborhoods and starting to police these neighborhoods not with people who live there, but with people from the suburbs who didn't look like the people in these neighborhoods. And that led to tension. Rufus Farewell, right here, I actually work with his son in Henrietta, who works in our daycare program. Rufus Farewell managed a gas station in the Red Line Plymouth Exchange neighborhood. One night in 1961, he was locking up at midnight, his gas station. The police came and arrested him for robbing the gas station. He tried to say, no, I'm not robbing it, it's my gas station. They didn't believe him, they locked him up, and for talking back, they brutally beat him within an inch of his life down at the police station while cuffed. He was put into a wheelchair because he could no longer walk, and then the next day, the church community, the Black church community, joined with Farewell, protesting on the steps of City Hall in an image that Looks a whole lot like the news last summer after what happened with Daniel Prude. And they fought back. Malcolm X came to town. Martin Luther King came to town. There was the Faison case, the A.C. White case, Denise Hawkins, Kenneth Jackson, story after story that I never learned about until very recently. But folks in the Black community in Rochester have not forgotten names like Rufus Fairwell, who fought back, who protested, who actually sued the city and won for what happened to him. But it wasn't enough. By 1964, people of color had had enough. Not enough change had happened. And on a hot summer night at a street dance, the police dogs were let out, a man was bit, it wasn't good, and the city erupted into protest and violence. A 3-day uprising, rebellion, or what some have called a riot happened. White-owned businesses were targeted, not black-owned businesses or white-owned businesses that had been kind to their black neighbors. They were directly targeted, destroyed, and looted. There was significant violence and significant peaceful protest at the same time. Over 1,000 people were arrested over the 3 days. 1,500 National Guard troops came out to Rochester to try to quell the violence and protest, and it left Rochester forever changed. If you haven't seen Carvin Eison's July '64, it's online, it's free, and it's at the library, and it documents this story incredibly well. And the direct cause, according to the folks who lived there, was the redlining. They had nowhere else to go. In fact, county historian Carolyn Vaca went through the arrest records and found the people that had committed the violence that had been arrested were folks who had directly been affected by urban renewal's displacement, people who didn't have running water in their census tract, and the people who had been victims of police brutality, feeling like they had nowhere else to go. Rochester wasn't alone. There were rebellions and riots in almost every major city, specifically in red line neighborhoods. The same neighborhoods where the protests were last summer for Daniel Prude and George Floyd. And in 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson used that opportunity to ram through the very weak but important 1968 Fair Housing Act that legally made redlining no longer enforceable, or racial covenants no longer enforceable. For the first time in our country's history, a black person or a Latino person could go to a bank and they could get a mortgage that was financed and subsidized by the federal government. But it was pretty too late, right? At this point, the suburbs have been largely built out. The subsidy now is not enough the way it had been 20 years ago for someone building a home in a town like Pittsford, and it made it really difficult to get into those towns. And Nixon knew this. But he responded to voters, and he ordered the Fair Housing Act not to be enforced. U.S. Secretary of HUD, in charge of enforcing this law, actually was fired because he tried to enforce the Fair Housing Act in Michigan, where he had formerly been governor. This is Mitt Romney's dad, the former presidential candidate. Nixon justified this firing in a memo to his chief of staff, saying this, something that I think you would hear a lot of town leaders say today. I'm convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong, saying I realize this position will lead us to a situation in which black people will continue to live for the most part in black neighborhoods and will there be predominantly black schools and predominantly white schools. He's describing Rochester, New York, right? Like, he knew what he was doing, and yet the electorate wanted him to do it, and they didn't enforce this law. Meanwhile, you have things like Brown versus Board. We know the famous stories of Elizabeth Eckford or Ruby Bridges in the South in the 50s when those laws were enforced, facing racial terror just for trying to go to work, mobs of angry white parents screaming at them, throwing rocks. Well, in 1971, the same thing happened in Rochester. After the NAACP, Dr. Cooper and others actually sued RCSD and won. It took 10 years for integration to go into effect in the Rochester area, and only in the Rochester City School District, where the high schools, they started a movement of busing to try to even out the numbers of black and white students. White folks did not like this. This mob, led by Mary Nicolisi, a noted Klan member at the time, who would gather in robes outside of the Jewish board member's house in RCSD, are seen here gathering outside of Charlotte High School. They're hanging nooses of black puppets from trees as students of color come into school on the bus. They're throwing bricks, rocks, and tire irons at students as they enter the school. Some of these parents would gather, over 150 of them, with their children, holding signs saying things like, black people go home and keep Marshall clean. The DNC reported here at Charlotte, tensions developed yesterday after 3 black girls were cut by flying glass on a bus that was stoned. James Beard, who organized the Black Student Union for self-defense and for the right to a fair, equal, and integrated education, described it like this. He said, we were on the bus, and as soon as we get to the graveyard, Holy Sepulchre out in Greece, over on Lake Avenue, they'd hide in the graveyard, and there was a wall. They'd come up from behind it, throwing bricks, rocks, iron, anything they could find at the bus. They'd be busting the windows, and people would be screaming. And this is a yearbook photo of James and his friends who formed for protection, walking in groups of 3s in the hallway to ensure their safety from what was happening. And yet James Beard, in his interview with DNC reporter Justin Murphy, still says it was worth it, because growing up in a segregated neighborhood, he'd been taught to hate white people. He'd seen only negative examples of white people, of police officers in his neighborhood, of white teachers at his segregated school at Madison. And then when he went to Charlotte High School, despite the violence and the evil that he faced, he also made white friends for the first time. White friends who actually supported his struggle for an integrated education. He says this, I thought all white people need to die, regardless of what was going on. But then I knew, wait a minute, all white people aren't like that. I actually love some of these people. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'm grateful for it. He said he wouldn't go back on the experience. But RCSD responded. Thousands of parents protested in the streets, holding marches. School board member Louis Cerulli, who School 34 is still named for today, led huge protests. Neighborhood school organizations formed and successfully forced RCSD to rescind the busing or school integration order, leading to some of the most segregated schools in the country today. So when you look at this redlining map and our population map, you can see those red and yellow line neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that are predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods, just like they were back in the 50s, back in the 60s. The same goes for poverty, concentrated in the inner city, and wealth concentrated in our suburbs, not by accident, fully by design. The same goes for owner occupancy of homes, for food insecurity, asthma prevalence, and lack of insurance, people struggling with high blood pressure, mental health issues, concentrated in those redlined areas where people of color were forced, and while you can move from those neighborhoods, it's incredibly difficult to still do it. And it's leading to difficulties in life expectancy. If you live in a red line neighborhood, you're expected to live 5 years less than someone from a green line neighborhood, according to the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Nationally, the wealth gap is so huge that it's going to take black families 228 years to earn the same amount of wealth that white families have today, unless we decide to have the courage to tell the truth about our history, to live these words of James Baldwin, who says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I hope you've been able to face with me today the stories of people of color that face these injustices, the way people like Howard Coles called out redlining and faced it, the way people like Alice Young fought back against the real estate agents who denied her a home, the way people like Rufus Fairwell fought urban renewal and police brutality, the way people like Dr. Cooper stood up to housing segregation, the way James Beard stood up to school integration. Maybe some of us will carry on that mantle and that legacy today as we work for justice in our community. In Isaiah 58, it reads, I'll tell you what it means to really worship the Lord. Remove the chains of the prisoners who are chained unjustly. Free those who are abused. Share your food with everyone who is hungry. Share your home with the poor and the homeless. Give clothes to those in need. Don't turn away your relatives. Then your light will shine like the dawning sun. Dr. Macaulay writes this in his book, Reading While Black. He says, according to Isaiah, the true practice of religion ought to result in concrete change, the breaking of yokes. Have we broken the yokes of racial injustice in our community when you see that data, when you see those policies? He says he doesn't mean the occasional private act of liberation, but to break the chains of injustice. What could this mean other than a transformation of the structures of society that trap people in hopelessness? Jesus has in mind the creation of a different type of world. And what does the creation of a different type of world look like? A world where in large-scale groups, people decide to stand up, to take action, to say this happened in our community. I've been that person doing nothing to create change. I'm going to turn in the opposite direction. I'm going to make mistakes, but I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to follow people of color, and I'm going to do my best to work for equity and for justice. And so it's my hope that you've looked at these different things, the racial covenants, the real estate industry, redlining, urban renewal, education, policing, all these different policies, the blackface shows, that it's helping you understand a little bit about why Rochester is in such dire straits with home ownership, with segregation, with our schools, with health equity. And so here's what I want us to do. In groups of 2, 3, or 4, whoever's around you, before we open it for questions, I want to give you a chance to just process a little bit. This is a really hard talk. I'm sorry, I'm not talking loud enough. This is a really hard talk. I talked a lot, and I told a lot of stories. I want you to just take a chance to think a couple of things here. First, what new information did you learn from the presentation that you weren't aware of before? What was something new that you learned tonight? Or what's something you're still wondering? And then, what emotions did you experience while listening to the information that was shared? What was a feeling that came up for you? And then we're going to go into a few more questions in just a minute about what this lecture may be meant for you and what it means for us to truly own this history. But let's just start here. What was something new you learned or something you're still wondering? And what was a feeling or an emotion that came up for you? Sound good? Let's take about 5 or 6 minutes, introduce yourself to someone you don't know around you, and start to share. And then we'll come back together for the next round of questions and Q&A. Super sorry to interrupt, folks, but our next question is this, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I'd love for you and your groups to think about these two questions. What personal meaning did this lecture on redlining have for you as an individual? Learning about this history, what's the personal meaning for you that you don't want to forget moving forward? And what does it mean to own this history as a congregation here at Pierce and as a community here in Rochester? We'll take a few more minutes to talk, and then we'll open it up for questions, for answers, and talk a little more about what this looks like in schools and some of the drama around that, and keep talking with your groups. Here we go. take about 1 more minute and we'll come back together. 1 more minute. Folks, can you hear me? All righty. If you could turn your attention back to the front, that would be excellent. We got about 10 more minutes. I'd love to answer some questions and hear your responses and reactions. And I'd also like to talk about one concrete step that we can take. More than one. All righty. So at the beginning, I mentioned I'm part of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. We're hosted by the Pathstone Foundation. We're fully funded by people who did redlining, like ESL Bank and Farish, who are trying to own some of their uncomfortable story with this. We offer free training, free curriculum that helps tell this story, not as a lecture, but as inquiry. Students start by looking at the racial dot map. No student is ever told that Rochester is segregated, but they do look at the map and draw their own conclusions. Most kids do seem to look at that map and say, I think we have a problem. Or the statistics about Penfield and Brighton and West Irondequoit, or about poverty. Kids are surprised that this is happening in their area. I know for me growing up, I had no idea. I wasn't taught it, and it wasn't talked about. And if we talked about poverty, it's those people's faults, versus maybe it could be someone's fault, but maybe it could also be a structure. Maybe it could be both. Maybe there's more to this story. It was never really raised. And so our curriculum helps students ask those questions. It doesn't indoctrinate. It's not critical race theory, a kind of made-up term that's used in legal studies, but you might have seen in the news. Instead, what we're doing is using inquiry, using primary source documents, and strategies to help kids learn how to have conversations about race, racism, to learn about activists in their communities like Dr. Cooper, Alice Young, and Connie Mitchell, and to learn about the laws and policies in place in their neighborhoods, at their schools, that helped create it. Not to make anyone feel bad, not to make anyone ashamed, but instead to empower kids to see that just like James Beard or just like Dr. Cooper, you have the power to stand up for what you think is right. It's not the teacher's job to tell the kid what's supposed to be right. That's their church, that's their family. But it's our job to ask the question, what do you want to do about this? And to create safe space for them to talk about it. Currently, we're in half the school districts across Monroe County. We're working with the faculty of every local college that has a school of education program, including here at Roberts, to train all pre-service teachers in doing this. Again, everything we do is free. We would love to partner with Churchville Chili. We're starting to make our way into Gates, but if you have children or grandchildren in Gates, your support would be incredible. But we really encourage you to reach out to your school boards and superintendents and say, it's really important that our kids from elementary through high school have the opportunity to learn this history, to engage with it, and decide what they want to do with it. And you can put them in touch with me. We would love to talk with them. And a lot of school boards are a little afraid right now. You've seen protests, you've seen fights break out in towns like Penfield. It's a hot button issue. Deciding, do we tell the truth about our history, or do we pretend it never happened and put our head in the sand? And school boards, they're getting yelled at. And it's up to folks like yourself, if this is important to you, to call and say, have courage, let's do this, I've got your back. So that's something you can do that's immediate, that we would love your help and support on. And then I'll just open it up to questions, and Todd will walk around and hand you a microphone. And I just want to invite folks, because of the time, to just kind of keep your question or comment, to keep it short, so we have time to get to a few more folks. Sound good?
Feel free.
All right, pop a hand up if you got a thought or a question.
Feel free to stand up so I can see you clearly, and I'll bring the mic to you and hold it for you so you can ask your question. Okay, one here, and then I'll be right there.
I was just thinking that you present this history, and it kind of goes up to about the 1970s. And then when Martin Luther King it started like a movement. At least I feel that things improved from the 70s to today. Could still, it needs more. But did you ever consider maybe adding that part of the history, your slide presentation, where you start covering kind of what went on after, from 70 to today?
Yeah.
That's something you might want to show to people.
That's a great question. So asking about telling more of the story. In our curriculum, we certainly cover up until today. I did start with today with the current data, but I didn't talk as much about the privatization of public housing. So for example, in the 40s, white people in Rochester got public housing. Like Fernwood Village, Ramona Park, Brighton Manor, black folks couldn't live there. But by the 1970s, Nixon put a moratorium on public housing, and then it became privatized with the '84 Tax Act. And now there's very little private public housing, right? So it's sort of interesting the way, that might be part of that story. But at the same time, a person of color can go to the bank and they're supposed to be able to get a loan. I could have talked a little more, I think, about how it's still the responsibility of that individual to sue the builder or bank for it, which that's not easy to do. So you got to have the means to go do that. So that's part of it. But the option is there. You saw how the biases successfully did that in Ellen Stubbs. So I think that's part of some of the story. There's certainly been gains. And I really hope that I wasn't trying to communicate that we haven't come a long way as a country. We absolutely have. But what I am trying to say is I will never be okay with a child in a red line neighborhood who's black living 9 years less than a child in Pittsford, just because of how they look and where they live, right? I'm not okay with the graduation rates in the city of Rochester or the amount of home ownership and wealth between families based on race. To me, we have to repair that damage, and we have to own how it got created. Because a big part of what happened from 1970 until today is that almost nothing happened. We just said, this is wrong and you can't do it anymore, right? But there was no reparation made. Dr. Cooper never got the money back. Thinking about some of those stories feels part of it. But I really appreciate what you're saying, and I'll think about adding more slides.
Okay, we'll come here to Leslie.
Yep.
I just want to know, do you have a website? I know we saw your email, but to look at the curriculum, what would we do?
I'll share the curriculum with Todd. You can read through all of it. It's all public. Our website's being built by RIT. That'll host the curriculum and all these stories, as well as a video project that's being completed. The students at RIT just aren't done yet. So soon, you can go to Pathstone Foundation, and we have a page, but it's just a picture of our team and a couple facts. Yep. Back there?
Yeah, how you doing? First of all,
Hi.
I want to tell you that I appreciate your depth into what my people have dealt with. It's very difficult. You hear our little conversation back here was about equanimity. We always hear, well, the Irish went through it, the Italians went through it, but our story is a much deeper story. In the 90s, and I'll be very fast. In the 90s, I'm a former auto dealer, and for 11 years I worked with Reverend Jesse Jackson at his Operation Push International Trade Bureau, which was about getting equanimity in loans for minority and women-owned businesses, and redlining exists there too in a very, very big way. When I bought my dealerships, I faced an uphill battle. There's very few minorities in that type of business environment. So my question is, while this is good, right, and I'm 64 years old now, so I'm tired, but when I was younger and I was in this fight, I was in this battle. Yeah, I am old. What passed, and as much as I appreciate what I heard tonight, what passed the hand-wringing, right? And I could feel the emotion in the room tonight from everybody, and you're all white. Rich and I are the only black guys in here. And I could feel your emotion, but past this tonight, what's the next step? How do you really move forward? How do you get the honesty that we know exists in our community from day to day that's really required? That's the ground floor of changing this. That's the rock, is the truth. In Germany, they don't have statues to people in the Holocaust, right? They own it. We don't own our racial issues. We try to say, oh, it's not so bad. Oh, you're okay. you're going to be okay. So that's really my question, is how do you move this to a point? This was one of the best talks that I've seen locally here. How do you move this to a point where there's change? The last thing I'm going to say real quick is I love seeing Reuben Davis up there. His son, Mark Davis, is a great friend of mine, and he's a faith friend. I'm the only Buddhist in the room. I practiced Buddhism with Mark for 20 years. I'm Buddhist. And so, but Reuben was his dad, and I met him a couple times before he passed, I think 8 or 9 years ago. But yeah, I texted Mark and told him that his dad's on the screen.
I would love if you would connect me with Mark, because his father's story is so incredible. Yeah, get with me after, for sure. Don't leave. You asked about how do we move forward, and talking about telling the truth has to be the first step. In order to repent or to make amends, we have to admit what we did wrong, right? You can't move. I can't forgive someone who hasn't really admitted, yeah, I hurt you. I get how I hurt you. I'm not telling you to move on. I'm asking you to, and I'm telling you what you need to do to repair this, right? We haven't done that in Rochester. We haven't done that as a country, right? Does that make sense? To me, you've got to start there. So for us that are in the Christian tradition in this room, understanding that is a key part of repentance. We own that we have sinned, we confess it, and we repent of it, which means changing the behavior, moving in the opposite direction. And that's where it can't just be, wow, I can't believe it. It can't be hand-wringing, because your story is real, and as is every other person of color's story in our community, and they're dealing with it every day, right? What are we going to do? We have the freedom to ignore it and not take action. One thing I do say, and this is why we do this with kids, is we want them to study the ways people like Judge Davis fought back. He was part of a club. He ran for public office. He was tricky sometimes, right? He had friends that were white. He had allies. He did it together. Like, we look at what Alice Young did. Look at Dr. Cooper's story. Let's study it. Let's evaluate it. And let's figure out how we move forward. And that's a big part of our curriculum and our call to the community. One thing we are doing is we're offering a 3-hour training to every real estate agent in town. We've partnered with the real estate board, helping them own their history, starting to say sorry. They recently said sorry to the Coles family and have a plaque of Coles at their office, and have started to put funds into owning this history and changing how they give loans to black families and work with black families to truly be anti-racist and equitable. Tiny start, but we've got to take action. But when we can own we're part of it, we can own that we benefited from it, I think we can start to move forward. But it's going to take courage too. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think I'm at the end of my time, right, Todd?
Thank you so much, Shane. We really appreciate you being here with us tonight and sharing. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, too, to invest this time in be educating ourselves and learning and listening. And I pray that we all will be moved to a point of not just, oh, that was an interesting story, or wow, that's amazing that happened, or I'm really ashamed, or whatever, just actually taking some action. I don't know what that is yet, but we're going to work at it. We're going to figure it out. And I know one of the questions that was asked from at the end of his time of interaction in small groups had to do what can we do now as a congregation. And so if your group generated some interesting ideas that you'd like to share with me, just please email that to me, and I'll try to gather some of those things. Maybe some interest could be developed out of that, or the Great Commission leadership team could meet and discuss some of those things, so that there might be some actionable steps that the Holy Spirit has laid on someone's heart here tonight that was shared in a small group setting. Or if that comes later, feel free to send me an email, danningberg_todd@piercechurch.org. Or call the office here and get that if you need it, all right? So, or check out the website. I think you can get to me through that means as well. So let's thank Shane and, yeah. Have a great rest of the night, and we'll see you on Saturday or Sunday.